With war clouds menacing the country, Abraham Lincoln took office as the 16th President of the United States on March 4, 1861. Following an attack on Fort Sumter on April 12, the Southern Confederacy proclaimed its independence. Yes, the war clouds had broken. In response, President Lincoln organized a volunteer army, with Washington serving as the hub for the newly created battalions. The army guarded the bridges from Virginia and all other entrances to Washington in order to keep the city safe from attack. General Robert E. Lee started constructing his defenses around Richmond at the same time. In order to achieve this, Lee gave Colonel Philip Street, George Koch command over the Potomac approaches. Colonel Koch then gave the order for soldiers from all throughout the South to advance and defend the city against an early onslaught. There was every sign that the North intended to attack Virginia from multiple directions, given the concentration of Union forces in the states bordering Virginia. The Orange and Alexandria Railroad would lead Washington toward Gordonsville, endangering the communication route between Richmond and the western part of the state. Fort Monroe would lead up the peninsula toward Richmond. Chambersburg, Pennsylvania would lead through the Shenandoah Valley and the surrounding Potomac valleys to the west. Ohio would lead into western Virginia along the Great Kanawha Valley's line toward Staunton, and simultaneously, Wheeling and Parkersburg would lead along the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad eastward to Grafton, and then southeast to Staunton. Of the four lanes, President Lincoln and Lieutenant Gen. Winfield Scott anticipated that Virginia would be overwhelmed and brought under control by traveling from Washington toward Richmond. The goals of this strategy were to strike the Confederate and Virginian capitals directly and to shield Washington from a potential Confederate attack. General Joseph E. Johnston's Army of the Shenandoah provided General Pierre Gustave Toussaint Beauregard with his left flank when he assumed command at Manassas. Under the leadership of Brig. Gen. Theophilus Hunter Holmes, a Confederate force of around 2,500 troops was positioned at Acquia Creek on the Potomac River on his right flank. Beauregard also established two small advanced outposts. One at Leesburg, commanded by Colonel Epperhunton, was in charge of monitoring the upper Potomac fords east of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the other at Fairfax Courthouse offered a direct view of the Union Army in Washington. Additionally, there were detachments protecting the entrances to the right from Alexandria to the south, and on the railway line that led from Washington toward Alexandria. Beauregard deduced that Union General Irvin McDowell had a 50,000-man force that was fully armed, based on information he considered credible. He was only able to muster about 18,000 soldiers and 29 weapons to counter this force. Beauregard therefore pleaded with President Davis to bring his army and the armies of Johnston and Holmes together at Manassas Junction. He intended to be prepared to launch a surprise attack on McDowell's flanks, back, and communication channel, obstructing his escape route and compelling him to give up. Richmond, however, did not think highly of these recommendations. Beauregard received word on July 15 from a Southern spy that the Union Army was preparing to advance on his location. Following President Davis's instruction, Beauregard ordered his outposts to return to Manassas Junction. He urged Davis to order the reinforcement of his Army of the Potomac at Manassas by the Army of the Shenandoah and General Holmes' brigade. After receiving his consent, Davis gave Johnston the authority to shift his command for the same reason and swiftly directed Holmes to report to Beauregard. Tuesday, July 16, in the afternoon, saw McDowell start to march in the direction of Manassas Junction. He crossed the Potomac River into Virginia and advanced westward toward Fairfax Courthouse and Centreville with an army of ill-trained and ill-equipped soldiers, largely old-timers and unskilled amateurs. Unopposed in his progress, his forces camped out in front of Fairfax Court House that evening. He resumed his advance on the 17th, having traveled 20 miles in 2 days, and arrived near Centreville, as well as the banks of Bull Run late that day. He was prepared to attack Manassas Junction after carrying out the first part of his plan, which involved driving the Confederates from their positions at Fairfax Courthouse and Centreville. The Confederate Army's forced evacuation from its camp behind Bull Run was the goal of the offensive's second phase. A portion of the Union Army would advance from Centreville against the Confederate Army, which was rumored to be encamped beyond Bull Run, close to Manassas Junction. An additional federal force would endeavor to circumvent the rebels, interrupt their primary supply route from Richmond, and compel their retreat in the direction of the Rappahannock River. Major Gen. Robert Patterson needed to maintain the Confederate forces under Johnston in the lower Shenandoah Valley, occupied for McDowell's strategy to succeed. Johnston would be unable to deploy reinforcements to help defend Manassas Junction if he did this. But Johnston's cavalry screen fooled Patterson, and on July 18, Johnston started Beauregard's reinforcement. General McDowell assembled his troops near Centreville on Thursday, July 18, leaving a division at Fairfax Courthouse, and marched southward toward Richmond. Bull Run became Beauregard's first line of defense. He dispersed his Army of the Potomac throughout the stretch, a distance of around 8 miles, from Union Mills, where the Orange and Alexandria Railroad crossed the creek, to the Stone Bridge, where the Warrenton Turnpike passed. With the exception of the fords, which were spaced a mile or two apart, the high, stony banks of the run formed an almost impenetrable barrier to troops. Beauregard therefore set up his defense in the following manner, needing simply to protect the fords. General Daniel Tyler of the Union cautiously advanced his division early on July 18 in order to gauge the locations of the Confederates. From Centreville, there were numerous public and private routes that went to Bull Run. There were 3 paths leading to Blackburn's Ford, Mitchell's Ford, and the Warrenton Turnpike, which crossed the Stone Bridge. Tyler proceeded down the path that led to Blackburn's Ford. Along with him were Captain Ramin Beck Ayers' battery, a cavalry squadron, and Colonel Israel Bush Richardson's brigade. General Beauregard, who was aware of McDowell's every action, had ordered forces from Manassas, Virginia, and Louisiana to gather at Blackburn's Ford. With the exception of 1 battery that was positioned on an open hill, his force was largely hidden due to the denseness of the forests. Tyler set Ayers' battery atop a prominent hill in the hopes of attracting their fire and learning their location, and the battery burst into flames. Richardson dispatched the 2nd Michigan Regiment as skirmishers at the same time. They got into a fierce competition. The 3rd Michigan, 1st Massachusetts, and 12th New York were sent forward to support this offensive, and these units were soon engaged in fierce action as well. Subsequently, musketry opened a fierce fire on the cavalry and the 2 howitzers that had been sent forward, as well as intense enfilading fire from a hidden battery. It seemed like a lifetime before General Longstreet summoned Early's 6th Brigade for assistance. This brigade, which included the 7th and 24th Virginia Volunteers, as well as the 7th Louisiana, under Colonel Harry T. Hayes, was prepared and anxious to go into action. The 7th Louisiana was brimming with pride, having already grabbed 40 rounds of ammo and attached strips of red flannel to their clothes to show that they were Confederates. Under the careful eye of their commanding general, they were ready to get into the fight. Shouts of orders swept through the camp, and before long the brigade was on its feet, sprinting down the dusty, scorching road toward the sound of the firing. All thoughts of glory were dashed when they topped the hill and plunged headfirst into a stream of bleeding, staggered soldiers making their way back from the fight. Even though some of them were holding broken limbs and open wounds, they all spurred the brigade forward together. With the arrival of Early's soldiers and 2 Washington artillery guns, the beleaguered line of Longstreet was fortified. The fight turned into an artillery duel as a result of the increased firepower, with the Confederate cannons returning fire round for round. McDowell gave the order for the Union forces to retreat back to Centreville, convinced that the Confederate position was unbreakable. The altercation at Blackburn's Ford persuaded McDowell that he was unable to forcibly cross Bull Run. Thus, he reconnoitered the Confederate lines on July 19 and 20. His reconnaissance verified that he could successfully cross the run above the Confederate front, but that attacking the Confederate front would not be wise. He could then crush the rebel army's left flank and advance through Beauregard's line, destroying it completely. So he made the decision to try to drive the Confederates to the left, away from the Stone Bridge and off the Warrenton Turnpike. Additionally, this would cut off Beauregard's and Johnston's army connection, the Manassas Gap Railway, making it impossible for Johnston to bolster the stronger force. But McDowell had no idea that Johnston's soldiers were pulling into Manassas Junction already. Thus, Johnston's force of 8,340 men and 20 guns, plus Holmes's force of 1,265 men and 6 guns, were in position by the 20th. These additional men were placed by Beauregard on the Confederate left, center, and left. The majority of his own force was positioned on his right, center, and right. He thought that McDowell, Beauregard's West Point classmate, would attack Union Mills with his main force in an attempt to turn his right flank. McDowell began a 2-pronged attack early on March 21. The main offensive was formed by the 2nd Division, commanded by Colonel David Hunter. They swept across Bull Run at Sudley Ford, far to the north of Beauregard's defensive fortifications, leading brigades under Colonels Ambrose Burnside and Andrew Porter. They then took Sudley's Spring Road southward and launched an assault on the left flank of the Confederates. The 2nd Division was followed and strengthened by Colonel S.P. Einselman's 3rd Division. Tyler's 1st Division launched a fake attack at the Stone Bridge, while the main assault was advancing, taking up the Confederates' left flank and allowing Hunter to enter their rear undisturbed. With Sherman's brigade positioned on the right and Skenk's brigade moving to the left, they started their march up the Warrenton Turnpike. Schenk's artillery threatened the cannon at the Stone Bridge by firing on the Confederate left as soon as it was in place. Sherman was to stand by Schenck and be prepared to cross Bull Run should the situation warrant it. Beauregard had just Cox's 5th Brigade ready to repel this Union attack. With most of their forces deployed along a 6-mile front, the Confederate forces were terribly out of position, and Beauregard was certain that the main Union blow would land on the right. The 4th South Carolina Volunteers and Major Robert Doe Wheat's battalion guarded the Confederate left at the Stone Bridge. On Sunday, July 21, just before dawn, pickets in South Carolina heard the faint rumbling of a major troop movement occurring beyond the bridge. Colonel Evans moved quickly to send a company from Wheat's battalion and a few of his Carolinians as skirmishers across the creek. The remaining brigade set up camp on hills close by, with views of the bridge. After approaching via the Warrenton Turnpike, Tyler's 1st Division reached the location and started applying pressure to the Confederates. After positioning his artillery, Tyler started intermittently shelling Evans' location. Evans' guns did not fire back because of their short range. When the Confederates' guns did not respond, McDowell surmised that they were gathering strength to attack his left flank. He kept Colonel Oliver Howard's brigade ready to defend against this. If the Confederates assaulted the left wing of the Union forces, Howard would then advance to reinforce Colonel Dixon Miles and Colonel Israel Richardson. Schenk's skirmish formation moved forward and confronted the Confederates. Despite the distraction, Evans and Wheat were not fooled as they observed a massive cloud of dust steadily creeping upwards over Bull Run and beyond the Confederate left. The two Confederate leaders decided in a brief strategy meeting that McDowell was trying to flank them, and that splitting the brigade was their only viable alternative. While Wheat's Tigers sidestepped nearly a mile upstream in an attempt to keep back the enemy long enough for Beauregard and Johnston to send assistance, the Carolinians would retain the bridge. Meanwhile, in Sudley Ford, the main Federal column kept up its flanking maneuver. McDowell started giving instructions for a quick advance because he thought Beauregard was sending reinforcements. After crossing Bull Run, the brigades of Burnside and Porter commenced their deployment, oriented towards the south. Colonels W. B. Franklin and Orlando B. Wilcox's battalions trailed closely after, joined by Ricketts and Arnold's artillery. Evans' meager 2 Regiment Brigade was the only one at this intersection, ready to repel the Union attack that posed a threat to the rebel left, which was tenuously held. Evans had already alerted Koch about the Union movement on their left flank and his army movements in response to this danger. He led 2 6-pounder howitzers, Wheat's battalion of Louisiana Tigers, and 6 companies of the 4th South Carolina Riflemen across the Young's Branch Valley to the high terrain known as Matthews Hill. He positioned his troops here to confront the Federal assault as it proceeded down the Sudley Road. Once in position, Wheat spread his troops out across a rolling area with splotches of trees, aligning them perpendicular to the stream. Union General Burnside's brigade moved into the jungle while Wheat's Catahoula guerrillas were setting up as skirmishers. Their bayonets were a brilliant reflection of the early dawn light, unexpectedly flushing out the Catahoula boys. Burnside's troops caused sporadic fire to break out along the line. The remaining members of Burnside's line and 6 of his artillery pieces soon entered the battle, and the single shots quickly combined into lengthy, thunderous volleys. One guerrilla noted, "Grape, bomb, and canister would sweep our ranks every minute," and the balls came as thick as hail. Wheat's soldiers, outnumbered 6 to 1, did their best to contain the fire by hunching down or hiding under strewn branches. Despite intense pressure, this little force managed to keep Burnside's soldiers at bay. After Wheat was reinforced by the 4th South Carolina and 2 artillery pieces, the Confederates forced the Union onslaught to retreat. Meanwhile, Beauregard started moving his forces around. In order to reinforce Koch, he gave the orders for the 1st Brigade of General Thomas Jackson, the batteries of Captain John David Imboden in Virginia, Major G. B. Walton, and General Barnard B. and Colonel Francis Bartow to march to the left. In a second push, Burnside's entire brigade, backed by 8 guns, was advanced. Vital minutes passed while Rhode Islanders and Louisianans engaged in a bloody duel. Their combat lines swept across the undulating terrain, surge after surge. The Union gradually drove Evans' troops back as their numbers grew. After hearing gunfire, B veered to the left and positioned himself on Henry House Hill, which is located south of the Warrenton Turnpike. He could see Stone Bridge and the Sudley Road as it intersected the turnpike from this hill, while Evans' artillery was raking havoc on the Federal batteries that were resisting him. B received a request for assistance from Evans. Evans was encouraged by him to retreat to B's location atop Henry House Hill. In the bewildering retreat, Wheat started to veer to the left with a few of his soldiers. Wheat tried to gather his men before making his stand among a field of haystacks. The sound of lead hitting flesh was horrible, but his warriors were answering his call. Wheat fell, a bull having driven a hole through its body. Unwilling to give up on him, his soldiers gathered and hurried him to safety. Despite the fact that Wheat and Evans' 11 companies were gradually being driven back, they kept the peace and successfully halted the advance of roughly 13,000 Yankees. However, Wheat's wounds posed a severe threat to this resistance because, in the absence of strong leadership, Wheat's battalion immediately fell apart, and the troops started to wander out to fight alone or in support of other orders in small groups. The Union forces stepped up their attack as they saw the Confederate ranks becoming more and more disorganized. Evans refused to back down and kept calling for more help. He was still full of fight. Upon observing the growing force of Burnside's assault, B commanded 2 troops to cross the valley. The Tigers rallied, wheeled, and faced this new Union charge with the assistance of the 2 just-arrived Confederate brigades under B and Bartow. The Tigers established their reputation as fierce fighters during this section of the battle. One survivor of the carnage that followed wrote, "I have been in battles several times before, but such fighting never was done. I do not believe as was done for the next half hour. It did not seem as though men were fighting. It was devils mingling in the conflict, cursing, yelling, cutting, shrieking." Despite the Federal infantry's numerical advantage, Burnside was unable to overcome this resolute front. Burnside, meantime, made a help request. Colonel Andrew Porter promptly provided it by dispatching a battalion of regulars to support his brigade, which was heading up the Sudley Spring Road. Burnside launched a third attack, this time backed by additional Porter's brigade battalions, 8 companies of regular U.S. troops, and 6 pieces of artillery. The clamor of combat grew unbearable. The fight continued until Porter opened a heavy barrage on Evans' left, causing the entire column to falter and sway. Colonels William Tecumseh Sherman and Erasmus D. Keyes led Union brigades that crossed Bull Run right above the stone bridge on McDowell's orders, then advanced on the Confederates' rear to force the stone bridge. Evans buckled under pressure from Porter on his left, Burnside on his center, and these new forces posing a threat to him on his right. The Confederate line was finally forced to collapse under the intense and sustained Federal bombardment, forcing them to retreat their last soldiers across Warrenton Turnpike. Then Bartow, B, and Evans marched their men up Henry House Hill's lower slope. The Federals were definitely in the lead by late morning. The severely wounded soldiers of B, Bartow, and Evans had been driven aside by the leading battalions, while Union reinforcements under the command of Sherman, Franklin, and others had crossed the turnpike and were making their way up Henry House Hill. Strong artillery support minus 20 or more pieces under the direction of 2 courageous and competent officers, Captains Charles Griffin and James B. Ricketts, arrived with the Federal soldiers. They started beating the Confederate line after deploying their artillery close to the hill's summit. Beauregard started moving more soldiers in that direction after realizing how serious the threat was to his left. To support Evans and B, the brigades of Holmes and Early as well as 2 regiments of General Bonham's brigade, each with 6 guns, moved quickly to the left. Beauregard held Ewell, Jones, and Longstreet in their designated positions along his right flank and along the center in order to keep the Union troops in their front and make demonstrations towards Centreville. With these directives in hand, Generals Pierre Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston galloped over to the battle area. By the time they reached Henry House Hill, B and Evans's disgruntled men were starting to withdraw. The first reinforcements to arrive were Hampton Legion, who started covering the retreat's back end. On Henry Hill, the soldiers of General Thomas J. Jackson formed a line to the right and rear. After sweeping down the slope where Evans had been holding them for so long, the Union in battle array crossed Young's Branch and the Warrenton Turnpike and started up the northern slope of Henry House Hill. One of the goals of the movement against the Confederate left was now that the Federal forces controlled the Warrenton Turnpike from the area near the Stone Bridge westward. However, there was a significant barrier preventing their plan from being fully implemented. Now that they were on a commanding elevation, the Union could not try to attack the Manassas Gap Railway because they were too close to the turnpike and the bridge. The urgent job now was to force the Confederates off the plateau. Johnston and Beauregard had joined the field officers of the commands of Evans and Bee in their desperate attempts to unite and reorganize their soldiers, but with no success. The Federal infantry was marching quickly in strong masses, and it looked like a calamity was coming. In a dejected tone, Bee rode up to Jackson, who was keeping his brigade in a full fronting stance, fatigued from his futile attempt to rally his soldiers, and exclaimed, "General, they are beating us back with composure." Jackson answered, "Then we'll give them the bayonet." General Bee was given fresh life by Jackson's flaming and belligerent gaze, his bold and prompt determination, and the dependable line of brave men who stood behind him. He rode, waving his hand to the left, and galloped back to his jumbled order. "Look, Jackson is standing there like a stone wall. Join the Virginians in rallying. We shall prevail if we decide to die here. Adhere to me." Several of Bee's men sprang to their feet in response to this clear call to duty, charging to the left in an attempt to stop the enemy's advance. But a bull knocked Bee down dead, and his charge broke. However, a general rally was staged. Additionally, his remarks left an indelible mark. Thomas Jackson went on to become, and always will be, Stonewall Jackson, and his unit was dubbed the Stonewall Brigade. However, there was no time to waste. At this vital phase of the conflict, Beauregard ordered the regimental standards advanced approximately 40 yards to the front of the still disordered commands of Evans and Bee. The men quickly rallied behind their colors after the field leaders attracted their attention and persuaded them to follow instructions. Johnston and Beauregard moved forward at this point, carrying the 4th Alabama's colors. The line that had fought all morning and had fled, routed, and disheartened, now advanced again into position as steadily as veterans. Beauregard subsequently wrote, "When Johnston noticed that the enemy was approaching in greater numbers, Beauregard convinced him to ride back a short distance to the Lewis House and bring the reinforcements forward as soon as possible." Fortunately for the Confederates, the final remaining reinforcements from the Army of the Shenandoah, a brigade under Brig. Gen. Edmund Kirby Smith, consisting of 1,700 well-rested and fresh soldiers, had just arrived at Manassas Junction via rail. Furthermore, the 6th North Carolina had just arrived at Manassas Junction by rail. 6 miles behind the action, General Staff officers led and rushed them to the pivotal location of the impending conflict, the Confederate left of the field. Beauregard started the war with 12 regiments, but with these reinforcements, his army grew to 25. All of these forces were focused on McDowell's forces right and rear. Beauregard then positioned the 7th Georgia and the 49th Virginia of Colonel William Smith to Jackson's left. Hunton's 8th Virginia and Hampton's Legion of South Carolinians were positioned behind Jackson's right to repel any assault from the Stone Bridge's direction. He held 13 field guns and 6,500 troops in position as he waited for 4 Federal brigades to assault. Approximately 11,000 soldiers from the federal government were getting closer to his position on the Henry Plateau. The Union soldiers advanced on the Confederate forces that were waiting in a disciplined line of battle. First taking the Robinson House on the Confederate right, and then the Henry House on its left center, they immediately positioned their batteries. They started to pour a cruel fire on the Confederate line from these newly taken positions. Their infantry used the partially sunken Sudley Road, which the Union had been pushing up, as a covered route up Henry House Hill, supporting their artillery. On the undulating Henry Plateau, the lines of combat were now rather close together. With a relentless and punishing fire pouring from both the left and the right, the Confederate cannons started to make terrifying holes in the approaching lines. Confederate infantry and artillery were wreaking havoc, and 2 companies of Captain James Ewell Stuart's cavalry added to the carnage by infiltrating the Federal ranks along Sudley Road while skirting the right flank. As more soldiers and artillery moved forward from behind, McDowell extended his right more and threatened to turn Beauregard's left in the process. A brave maneuver by the Union to shift some of its cannons to the front opened the door for troops from the 33rd Virginia to charge forward and seize them. Gazing north from his commanding position, Beauregard observed the steady and unwavering advance of Federal forces. He moved his line of battle to meet this attack right away. Fresh Union forces swiftly launched the attack, advancing up the northwest slope of Henry House Hill, traversing the Young's Branch Valley, and sweeping down the slopes from the north. By sheer force of numbers, they forced the Confederates back across the plateau, reclaiming their lost position and taking back the cannons they had lost. The battle had devolved into a death fight over Henry House Hill. McDowell was able to extend his line and threaten to turn Beauregard's left as well as his right because of his numerical advantage. In response to this impending attack on his left, Beauregard was resolved to go on the attack. The B, Bartow, Evans, and Hampton forces, which had been engaged in combat nonstop since the early morning, were by this point almost worn out, but they nevertheless reacted with determination and quickness, hitting the Federal left. Jackson struck the center with powerful, consistent blows, while Smith's Virginians and Colonel Lucius J. Gartrell's Georgians advanced from the right. This daring maneuver, which encompassed both infantry and artillery, completely removed all Federal forces from the plateau and took control of Captains James B. Ricketts and Charles Griffin's guns. The Confederates applauded this masterful counter-move's effectiveness. The whole plateau was swept clear of the enemy, who were driven down the slope and across the turnpike on our right and the valley of Young's Branch on our left, leaving in our final possession the Robinson and the Henry houses, with most of Ricketts and Griffin's batteries, the men of which were mostly shot down where they bravely stood by their guns. General Beauregard would later write of this event. The Confederate charge, however effective, did not extend beyond McDowell's right, which stretched some distance beyond Beauregard's left and across the woods to the west of Sudley Road. Johnston dispatched the 2nd and 8th South Carolina to the Confederate left after they had moved from the Confederate right on Bull Run. They arrived to the field just in time to intercept McDowell's rightward movement, in time to join the South Carolinians in stifling intense competition. Preston's 28th Virginia and Colonel James L. Kemper's Virginia Battery also showed up, along with Sykes' battalion of regulars, McDowell's right flank cavalry and artillery. However, they did not have the strength to drive the Union Army back. A Federal bullet gravely injured Colonel Smith when his 4th Brigade crossed the woods to the left of Sudley Road. Colonel Arnold Elzey was given the order to march his brigade to Beauregard's far left before meeting the Union advance as it approached the Chin Farms wide fields. Concurrently, McDowell was exerting great effort on his left flank to turn the Confederate right flank by directing the brigade of Brig. Gen. Erasmus D. Keyes across the turnpike close to the Stone Bridge and then southward, beneath the shelter of the Henry House Plateau, to a point that would be advantageous for an attack. Captain Ephraim G. Albertus's battery and Latham's battery were positioned to defend this flank, and they greeted the advance with a fierce fire. The Confederates were able to successfully thwart this movement, proving to McDowell that trying to turn Beauregard's right was fruitless. Confederates were now pouring deadly rounds of musketry and cannon fire into McDowell from the dense woods to his right. Reluctant to give up the field, McDowell established a new front that was formidable in length and quantity, as well as having a crescent shape as it crossed Sudley Road on the high ground north of the turnpike. He launched a third assault on Henry House Plateau, this time putting forward a formidable line of skirmishers. Colonel Arnold Elzey was now pressing hard on his right, and the fury of that conflict was increased by the arrival of Early's Great Virginia Brigade from McLean's Ford, which swiftly frustrated his plan. By circumnavigating the backside of the forest that Elzey had traversed, Early's brigade closed in on the flank of the Union right, which was already hesitant, causing that wing to begin retreating completely. After learning of the triumph on his left, Beauregard gave the order for a shade charge on McDowell's left to everyone in the line. This forced the already collapsing Union lines off the battlefield, forcing them to split in order to escape the Confederate bombardment. The Union was utterly destroyed beyond control as a result of this unexpected, powerful, and swift blow. Others, overcome with panic, participated in the retreat from danger as regiment after regiment buckled and fled in chaos. The Yankees were so desperate to get away that they threw away their equipment, leaving muskets, knapsacks, and other items all over the place. The Army of the Union was airborne. Beauregard gave the command for every soldier on the field to follow the enemy that was fleeing. While Longstreet's brigade crossed at Blackburn's Ford with orders to hit the enemy at Centreville, Bonham's brigade advanced, instructed to strike the enemy at the crossing of Cub Run, almost halfway between the Stone Bridge and Centreville. The roadblocks leading to Cub Run caused Bonham to veer towards Centreville. Consequently, both brigades pursued the same goal and were placed under the leadership of the top officer Bonham. They marched past the deserted Federal campgrounds. At this intersection, Bonham gave the order to halt the chase. The reason for this was because, as the Federal right was fully withdrawing, Beauregard got information that a sizable Federal force had breached the Confederate right of the Bull Run line and was advancing on the supplies depot at Manassas Junction. Beauregard gathered the Ewell and Holmes brigades and got ready to repel the enemy's impending counterattack. Simultaneously, he summoned all the soldiers involved in the chase to support him. Longstreet put the circumstances as follows. The infantry was placed on the sides of the road, beneath the protection of the forests, when the retreating column was passing through Centreville. This allowed room for the batteries to be put into action in the open, Bonham's brigade on the left, and Longstreet's division on the right. Just as the guns were ready to fire, word leaked out that the enemy was actually moving forward, attacking the Confederate right, rather than retreating quickly. Instructions or reports of instructions were sent with this report, instructing the brigades to take up their positions behind the run. I called the report ludicrous, asserted that I knew of a withdrawal like the one I was witnessing, and gave the order to fire the batteries. As they got closer to McLean's Ford, the site of the anticipated Federal attack, Beauregard saw that Jones's brigade was recrossing the river following an earlier order to advance. At McLean's Ford, these soldiers were misidentified as Federal troops, and someone hurried to notify headquarters of a Union advance. It was almost nightfall now, and it was too late to pick up the abandoned pursuit of the army in retreat. As a result, the excellent chance to finish the victory by continuing to beat the Federal troops was missed. The pursuit was eventually called off by nightfall and confusion among the Confederates, and the weary but jubilant rebels halted and gathered around sputtering campfires to share stories of their day. About 18,000 troops from both sides participated in the brutal day's activity, with the South losing about 2,000 of them. Following his attention to his men's needs, Beauregard rode to his headquarters near Manassas Junction, where he discovered General Johnston and President Davis at approximately 10 o'clock at night. Davis reached the battleground just in time to see the final Union forces withdraw across Bull Run. As a reward for this outstanding triumph, Beauregard was given a full general commission in the Confederate States Army the following morning, on July 21, 1861. At 5:45 p.m. on the 21st, General McDowell telegraphed General Scott from Centreville, "We went by Bull Run, engaged the enemy, who appeared to have recently received reinforcements from General Johnston. After several hours of driving, we eventually overtook them. They came together and defeated us, but only to provide us the seemingly final win. However, the enemy's reserves ambushed our soldiers, leaving them dehydrated and disoriented from gunfire, and forcing us to retreat from the position we had taken over, which overlooked Manassas. Following this, the soldiers gradually deserted the field and were unable to be roused. The enemy outflanked Richardson at Blackburn's Crossing in the interim, and we are now forced to defend Centreville until our men can rally behind it. The town is being held by Miles' division." Afterwards, he telegraphed from Fairfax Courthouse, "The men haven't eaten since breakfast because they abandoned their haversacks during the battle and left them behind. We have run out of artillery ammo. The majority of the men are a demoralized, bewildered mob. All of the commanders believe that there was nothing to be gained on this side of the Potomac. Nonetheless, we shall try at Fairfax Courthouse. We find out through a prisoner that 20,000 people from Johnston joined last night and are marching on us tonight." He again wired early the following morning from Fairfax Courthouse. Many of the volunteers left on their own initiative rather than waiting for permission to cross the Potomac. They are now completely disorganized as they pour through this site. Even if they were willing, they could not be ready for action by tomorrow morning. Prisoners tell me that the enemy has a sizable force and is happy, so we should be pressed here tonight and tomorrow morning. We heard something about a cannon on our rear guard. I now believe, as did all of my commanders at Centreville, that the only course of action is to retreat back to the Potomac, and I will do so as frequently as I can. This was the East's first major military exercise, and it was held in the massive amphitheater surrounded by hills close to Manassas Junction, Virginia. Because neither side had adequately prepared its troops for a full-scale conflict, Battle of Bull Run featured both sad and comedic elements. Initially appearing to be a win for the North, the Yankees led by Irvin McDowell were soundly defeated by Joseph E. Johnston's reinforcements, who joined Beauregard's forces. Manassas was a noteworthy victory for the South. Generals Johnston and Beauregard thanked the soldiers for a glorious, triumphant, and complete victory in the speech that was published. A week ago, an immense number of men, equipped with every luxury that contemporary design and expert craftsmanship could imagine, descended upon Virginia. Their people heralded their approach with joyful expressions of victory they expected. Their ministers, senators, and women arrived to see the immolation of our army and the subjection of our people, and to celebrate the outcome with raucous revelry. Their generals arrived in nearly regal state. We, your generals commanding, are able to thank you on behalf of our entire nation for your patriotic courage, heroic gallantry, and devoted daring in the actions of the 18th and 21st, which caused the enemy's hosts to be scattered and a signal and glorious victory to be achieved. We do this with the deepest gratitude to an all-powerful God, whose hand is evident in protecting our homes and liberties. The events of the 18th and 21st were merely your persistent and unceasing display of patriotism against the enemy's relentless columns, which more than tripled your numbers. These endeavors culminated on the evening of the 21st in a victory so total that the invaders were forced to flee shamefully from the field and make their way back to their entrenchments, more than 30 miles away. They left almost all of their artillery, along with many thousands of weapons, gear, supplies, baggage, and other items, on the battlefield. They also left almost all of their injured and dead, in addition to thousands of prisoners. And thus, Virginia fell from the hands of the Northern hosts. Combatants, we commend you on a feat that safeguards our nation's freedom. We extend our congratulations to each and every one of you men who had the honorable opportunity to fight in the Battle of Manassas and take part in this victory of courage and truth. You have ushered in a new chapter in the history of liberty, and future generations will hail you as blessed. Keep up this admirable dedication, always seeking the protection of a just God, and before much longer time passes, we will be acclaimed as the saviors of a 10 million-person nation. Friends, the blood they sacrificed for our noble cause is a priceless and acceptable sacrifice to the Father of truth and right. Our fallen brethren have gained eternal fame on earth. Their graves are next to Washington's tomb. Their spirits have been united in eternal communion with his. We're going to cling to the land where our brothers and Washington's dust has become mixed together. Either we shall pass this land on to our offspring without charge, or we will end up in our comrades' new graves. We take one tear off their laurels and proceed to exact revenge. Combatants, we appreciate you for fulfilling your full obligation in the service of your country and congratulate you on your magnificent, victorious, and total victory. After the Federals fled in the direction of Washington, Beauregard set up camp at Centreville and started training his Confederate soldiers, who were still relatively inexperienced.